After the conclusion of a presentation to a Christian community on the resurrection appearances of Jesus, a member of the congregation replied, "I'm a psychiatrist. I treat people who hear voices and see things that aren't there." His comment was sincere and serious. It was also puzzling. Did this psychiatrist think that these reports found in the Gospels and New Testament literature were mere literary creations? Were they simply symbols of something, but nothing more than that? Or, to use psychiatric jargon, were they nothing but hallucinations? In psychiatry, this word hallucination carries a pejorative meaning. The puzzlement arises because contemporary cognitive neuroscience has researched and described in considerable detail the function of the brain and nervous system in human consciousness, in its many variations. The average human person changes levels of consciousness many times daily. Human beings are capable of experiencing more than 35 different levels of consciousness. Further, ethnographic evidence indicates that perhaps as many as 90% of cultures on Earth experience many of these different levels of awareness on a routine basis. The technical term for this human experience is alternate states of consciousness, or ASC experiences. The resurrection appearances are just one example of altered state of consciousness that are reported throughout the Bible, many of which we have been covering in this Bible Alive playlist, Consciousness and the Bible. From the beginning to the end of the Bible, the texts are replete with ASC experiences. Genesis chapter 2, verse 21, and the creation of Adam, where a deep sleep is cast on the human being, is the first expression or example of an ASC experience. Isaiah 29, verse 10, Yahweh pours out deep sleep on the people, shutting the eyes, covering the heads. When David steals the water jug and spear from King Saul, all remained asleep because a deep slumber from Yahweh had fallen upon them. The book of Revelation is full of ASC experiences. Revelation chapter 1 verse 10, John of Patmos says that he was caught up in spirit. That could be translated as, I fell into trance. Revelation chapter 4 verse 2, at once I was caught up in spirit. Again, fell into trance is an adequate translation. Revelation 17 verse 3, then he carried me away in spirit, could be, brought me into trance to a deserted place. Revelation 21 verse 10, he took me in spirit, or he took me in trance to a great high mountain. Beginning with the heavy, divinely induced sleep in the first creature, Genesis 2 verse 21, and ending with the book of Revelation, which records the seer's trance experiences, it's pretty clear that altered states of consciousness are a select moment during which God reveals God's self and important information for human beings. Genesis chapter 15 verse 12, the sun is about to set and a deep sleep falls upon Abram. Dark dread descends upon him. Job chapter 4 verse 13 to 15. In my thoughts during visions of the night, when deep sleep falls on mortals, fear came upon me. Drawing upon her extensive cross-cultural research, anthropologist Dr. Felicitas Goodman identified 4 elements in an ecstatic trance experience. 1. The visionary is usually frightened by the experience. 2. He or she doesn't initially recognize the person who is appearing or what is being seen. 3. The person in the vision offers calming assurance followed by self-identification. Fear not, it is I. If it is an object that the visionary is seeing, the visionary will seek to identify the object. Is it a flying saucer? Is it a saint? Is it Bigfoot? Is it the face of Jesus? And so on. Finally, the visionary receives either some useful information, such as an answer to a problem, insight for a new direction in life, or a commissioning. In the resurrection appearances, the women are frightened by their experience. Mark chapter 16, verse 8, they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Matthew chapter 28, verse 7 through 8, the angel says to the women, do not be afraid. Luke chapter 24, verses 4 to 5, while they were puzzling over this, look, 2 men in dazzling garments appeared to them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. The person appearing in the vision offers calming assurance to dispel the fright. Do not be afraid. Matthew 28, verse 5 and 10. The angel says to the women, don't be afraid. Then Jesus says to them, do not be afraid. In Mark chapter 16, verse 6, the angelic young man says to them, do not be amazed. Luke chapter 24, verses 36 to 37. While they were still speaking about this, Jesus stood at their midst and said to them, peace be with you. But they were startled and terrified and thought that they were seeing a ghost. At first, those who see him often don't recognize the risen Jesus, someone they knew when he lived and walked among them. Mary Magdalene mistook him for a gardener in John chapter 20, verse 15. The disciples on the road to Emmaus thought that he was a stranger in Luke chapter 24, verses 15 through 16. Their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. The disciples in Jerusalem thought that they saw a ghost, Luke chapter 24, verse 37. But they were startled and terrified and thought that they were seeing a ghost. The disciples on the Sea of Galilee saw a stranger on the shore who gave them advice about where to cast their nets. John chapter 21, verse 4. When it was already dawn, Jesus was standing on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. Sometimes the visionary does recognize the person appearing in the vision. Mark chapter 16, verse 5. On entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side. Matthew 28, verse 5. The angel said to the women in reply, do not be afraid. Luke 24, verse 4. Look, 2 men in dazzling garments appeared to them. John 20, verse 20. The disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. John 20, verse 28. Jesus came, though the doors were locked, and stood in their midst and said, peace be with you. John 21, verse 7. So the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. Finally, the experience offers new information. These 3 texts, Mark chapter 16, verse 6, Matthew 28, verse 6, and Luke chapter 24, verse 6, gives the new information that Jesus has been raised by God. Consider that the experience of the risen Jesus in the story of the 2 disciples on the way to Emmaus, Luke chapter 24, 13 to 35, reveals that all that the scriptures said must happen to Jesus. Jesus instructs his travel companions, opening their minds to understand the scriptures. Consider that this experience, recorded in John chapter 20, verse 17, reveals that Jesus is going to his Father. Sometimes these experiences offer instruction, like in Mark chapter 16, verse 7, and Matthew chapter 28, verses 7 through 10. These experiences instruct the visionaries to go and meet the risen Jesus in Galilee. In other instances of seeing the risen Jesus, the visionaries receive a commission. This experience in Matthew chapter 28, verses 16 through 20, commissions the visionaries to go preach to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, dispersed among all the nations. The experience of Luke chapter 24, verse 48, commissions the visionaries as witnesses. The experience of John chapter 20, verses 21 through 23, commissions the visionaries to bring new members into the Johannine Jesus group. Characteristics, therefore, of vision experiences, identified by Dr. Felicitas Goodman as existing in all cultures, are quite evidently present in the New Testament accounts of those who saw the risen Jesus. First, they were frightened by the experience, startled and terrified. Secondly, initially they don't recognize Jesus. Third, Jesus or the angels in the visions offer calming assurance. Be not afraid. Finally, the visionary receives either some useful information or a commissioning.